All right, welcome back. We just covered very quickly a lot of the diversity on Earth, probably the majority of it. So prokaryotes, um, protists, and fungi. And now we're going to talk about plants. So plants themselves are defined by organisms that make their own food through photosynthesis. So they are autotrophs. Um, they're always sessile, which means they don't move. They live on land and they're multicellular. So there are some other organisms that might fit some of these um, categories, but it has to be multicellular, it has to be sessile, and at least it needs to live on land or its ancestors. So there are a few plants that have gone back to the water. So flowering plants that live in the water, like water lilies, um, and there are some like cattails that kind of grow out of the water. Those are plants, but a lot of times things that you see growing in the water that you think are plants, like all green photosynthetic things in the water, many of those are protists. Many of them are algae. Um, Most plants live on land. So the algae, though, were the ancestors of plants. So at some point, about 472 million years ago, some algae made it onto land, and there were some pros and cons to living on land. So there were new niches, right? There was much less competition. It was just kind of, this open land with no plants living there. Lots of sunshine. Nobody else was blocking it out, and lots of carbon dioxide, right? Um, there are more gases in the air than in the water. Um, but the negatives to living on land were that they had to deal with gravity and they didn't have easy access to water. So the protists that plants evolve from don't have vessels for water transport. If we think of, you know, um, a leaf, right? It has a vein, right? It has veins going through it. And the whole trunk of a plant or the stem of a flower is for water transport. There are actually veins in there. But if you live surrounded by water, that's not important. So the marine protists did not have any sort of water transport. And the very first plants to evolve didn't either. And so there were some challenges that they were not able to overcome. They had to deal with gravity and they had to deal with evaporation. So the very, very first plants were mosses. So, or something very, very similar to mosses. They're very short, right? And they actually don't have any veins, and they can only grow in very moist habitats. So if you may have moss in your yard, and you'll see it growing under a tree where there's not a lot of sun, so they don't dry out too much, and then they'll turn brown and go dormant when it's dry out. And they rely on just diffusing water from cell to cell rather than having a central transport system. So they can't get too big. There's only so much diffusion you can do. So these are short plants to deal with diffusion and gravity, and they are really limited in where they can grow. So as you would imagine, the next big evolutionary innovation, a big step forward for plants, was to have vascular tissue or veins. So this ability to move water um, enabled plants to grow much taller, and a root system that could tap into the ground made them, first of all, more stable, but also they could get to water that was, even when it was dry out, they could access water that was underground. So roots and veins were a really important evolutionary innovation. So the very first vascular plants were ferns, and these. So if you remember, the first plants were about 470 million years ago. Vascular plants became dominant about 360 million years ago. So it took like 100 million years or so. They have a central vessel to transport water, um, but they can grow much, much taller than mosses, right? So there are some that are a few feet tall. They don't have seeds though. So just like bryophytes, mosses, the very the ferns don't have seeds. They have, if you've ever looked at the back of a fern leaf, they have, this is my drawing of a fern, right? They have this feathery look. Um, on each of these little fronds, they'll have these dots. These are spores. So they have spores that inside of them they will have gametes, and those will just kind of rain down and just fall, not very far, and then a new little fern will grow from there. So this isn't the most efficient, best way to reproduce, but this is, the very first land plants had. As you can imagine, in the water, um, one little spore can kind of float around, and it's protected by the water. On land, that's not the case. So the next big innovation for plants was the seed. So a seed is actually an embryo. It is a baby plant. It is diploid. It's been fertilized already, and it has its own little protective coating and some nutrients in there. So it can survive for a little bit on its own before it needs to be, planted and start growing. So a seed is its own little baby plant. And this innovation enabled them to get a little further away from their parent and also to withstand some bad weather and things like that. So this was a great innovation and really helps the embryo survive. They can be dispersed via wind, or animals, or water, or fruit. So the main two categories of seed producing plants, the first one to evolve were the gymnosperms, so these are the conifers like pine trees, but also ginkgo trees, and angiosperms, which are flowering plants, the majority of plants on earth today. So the gymnosperms this is just a brief look at them. So they include the ginkgo, which is the only surviving member of this plant family, of its plant family, but also conifers, of which there are many varieties, and these cycads, which are this picture on the right, which look like giant pineapples, but they are not pineapples. So the gymnosperms became dominant about 160 million years ago, so about 200 million years after the ferns. They have a very large range today. They grow on every continent except Antarctica. And they are able to withstand, or different ones can withstand very extreme in temperature, humidity, things like that. So they can thrive in many different environments. All of them produce their gametes in a cone. And there are actually female cones and male cones, which you may not have realized. So if you are looking at a pine tree, um, they often have, usually they have both male and female cones on the same tree. The females will be the bigger cones and the males will be the little cones. And then when pollen leaves the male cones, it will go into, actually find an ovule of a female cone and fertilize it, and that will produce a seed. So fertilization is one step, and then a little seed is produced. So if anyone's ever had pine nuts, which are made, part of pesto, that is the nut from a pine cone, which is a seed. And then finally, the next huge innovation were flowers, right? So we've gone from just being on land to get sunshine and lots of carbon dioxide for your photosynthesis, to getting some vascular tissue, to producing seeds to protect your embryos, and now flowers. So, what is so great about flowers? Well, first of all, they attract someone to do your fertilization for you, right? So they attract pollinators. So pollinators will move from flower to flower and carry pollen, which is the male, has the male gametes in it. Pollen has sperm in it. It will take the sperm to the ovaries of another flower. So the fertilization is taken care of in flowers, and then they produce, often, not all angiosperms will produce fruit, which will then get carried around by another animal. So your dispersal of your seeds is taken care of too. So as you can imagine, this is such a successful way of reproducing that these organisms radiated rapidly, once they evolved. So, only a few million years after gymnosperms, the angiosperms kind of took over. And I think we'll stop here and then pick up in a little bit with plant and animal relationships, which we've kind of hinted at already.